Let me preface this story. While I was an imaginative child at the time of this story, I knew the difference at age 6 between imaginary and reality. I had an imaginary friend growing up as an only child, but I knew that it was just that, imaginary. When I was 6 years old, my mother and I lived in this house that was much bigger than the two of us needed. We called it the Big House. Original, I know, and still call it that to this day when we speak about our time living there. It was a 3-story house. The first floor was comprised of the kitchen, dining room, and living room. Second floor was 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, and the third floor was just one large room. That was my room. It doubled as a bedroom and playroom because of the size. My room had 2 little cubby doors, one open to a small storage space, and the other my mum never got to open. It had a small oval knob, like one of those keyholes that was meant for one of those skeleton keys. This will be relevant later. I was not only an only child, but I also had no neighborhood kids to play with, no cousins or family friends. I blame this fact on why I'm still socially awkward, but I digress. Up until this particularly sunny day, there had not been any unusual activity in the house. I'm 33 now, and yet the memory of this is still so clear. I had just got my first ceramic tea set. The set was creamy white, with delicate pink flowers hand-painted on each piece of the set, even the tiny spoons. I had gathered my 2 favorite childhood toys, a rag doll named Rattle and a bear with a clown hat called Snuffy. I had snuck down to the bathroom and filled the teapot with water, and I was fixing to have my first official tea party. I sat in front of the window where the sunbeams landed on the floor. It was fall, and the spot where the sunbeams hit were always warmest. I had been playing with Snuffy and Rattle for about 10 minutes when I realized, while looking down at the tea set across from me, were a pair of light blue shoes. It happened gradually. It's not like they popped into existence. It's more like when you're looking somewhere else, so your brain just doesn't register what you're looking at right away. As I looked up, I saw a girl. She was about my age, with copper hair and a knee-length blue dress, with lace around the neck and hemline. She wore a silver locket around her neck, and the blue shoes I had first seen. For some reason I wasn't afraid. I just asked if she wanted to have some tea. She just nodded and sat in front of me. It's only years later that I fully realize that she made absolutely no noise in doing so. I don't know how long we played. She never spoke, just nodded or shook her head, and the only noise she made was a peal of laughter. It was after this laughter that I heard my mother open the door at the foot of my stairs, and she called out, "What are you doing up there? I can hear you squealing all the way down in the kitchen." When my mother had opened the door, I had jumped and looked over my shoulder towards it, and when I turned back to look at the girl, she was gone, her teacup still full. Snuffy had fallen over, but nothing else had moved. "Just playing with my tea set, Mama," I called down the stairs. Still staring at the now empty space in front of me, I was more confused than scared. That is until I heard a squeaking hinge coming from behind me. I whipped around looking for the sound, and there it was. The door to the cubby that I had watched my mother try for hours to open was now open. It was open just an inch, that's it, an inch, and I sat there for what felt like an hour just staring. Part of me was waiting for a monster to come out of it. It felt weird. My little mind couldn't figure out what had happened. I debated yelling for my mum, or maybe just bursting into tears, but finally I gathered the courage to slowly walk towards the little cubby door. Inside was a very tiny space, maybe 3 by 3 feet and 4 foot high. There were some old newspapers and debris from years of being untouched. Then I saw a small ring on the floor. Not one you wear, like an old door knocker. I pulled it, and as it opened I heard something slide across the hatch. Once the hatch was opened, I looked down into the little door. I was looking down into my bathroom linen closet. I laughed. Even at age 6, I realized I had been spooked by a cubbyhole that just had a secret door to the bathroom. As I was looking down, I heard my mother come into the bathroom, so I waited for her to pass the closet and yelled out, "Ooh!" I swear she almost fainted. She opened the closet and started, "Why, you little," but then trailed off. From above, I watched her looking all around the lower shelves of the closet, which made me giggle. She looked up in surprise, which caused me to slam my little hatch closed. As it closed, I saw what had slid off the hatch. It was a small silver locket. Moments after I had closed the hatch, my mum was running up the stairs yelling my name. She asked me how I had opened it, so I told her what I've just told all of you. I remember the dumbfounded look she had at the end as I held up the silver locket, slightly tarnished and covered in dust. After that, weird stuff happened all the time in that house. We would wake up in the mornings with every kitchen cabinet open, the water turned on, and the faraway sound of giggling on occasion. The washer started with no one near it. Nothing that bothered my mum, strangely, and I kept the necklace until I lost it in 5th grade. Regrettable. I never saw the girl again. I had seen one other apparition, a ghost, in our basement the same month we moved. My mother and I lived in that house alone. Keep in mind I wanted to blow bubbles, and the giant jug of bubbles was kept on the basement stairs. I went to go get it, and when I bent down to grab them, I could see our washer and dryer. Standing in front of them was a tall, balding man with black hair and a half-unbuttoned plaid shirt, and what appeared to me as black dress pants. When I saw him, he looked directly at me and was then gone. I live in a notoriously haunted city. Nearly all the houses I've lived in have been haunted. I'm not really fazed by it anymore, however the scariest thing that's happened to me was when I was living in my childhood home. I went downstairs one night to get a midnight snack. When I came up the stairs to go back up, I saw someone in a brown shirt and blue jeans sprint up the stairs. I was startled, but since my brother usually wore the same clothes, I wasn't completely scared. I went into his room to tell him to knock it off when I saw he wasn't there. I looked outside and his car was gone. Turns out he was at his girlfriend's house. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up, thinking there was someone in the house. My dad ran upstairs to find the person, but there was no one there. He searched every room, nook, and cranny, but there was nothing. Suddenly, I heard him yell and sprint down the stairs. That was the first time I've ever heard him scream, so I was beyond terrified. However, he calmly came back into his room where my mother and I were and told me to sleep with them. I was terrified at this point and decided not to ask questions. The next morning I finally asked my dad what happened, and he told me that when he went into my room he felt an insanely cold air come over him. He looked towards my bathroom and saw a man with a brown shirt and blue jeans appear, smile at him, nod his head, and disappear into the wall. Needless to say, I barely ever used that bathroom again after that. My eldest sister was living in an older, smaller, modest home in a summer village, and after some time she and her husband moved back to the popular little village in central Alberta. She was younger and had 2 young daughters at the time and was living with her then boyfriend. I went over for a visit on Valentine's Day and had school early that next morning. It was a beautiful day and my nieces were playing outside, around 6 or 7 at the time. They were carrying on a conversation with whom I initially thought was each other. Time passed, and by the time they came back inside, were playing in their rooms at the back of the home. They were laughing and giggling, so when I went to check on them, they definitely were speaking to someone else. I asked the girls who they were talking to, and one of them said, "The fireman, Auntie, he's really nice." And I kind of played it off that he was an imaginary friend of theirs, not wanting to scare them. I asked them to describe him to me, and they're like, Just like any fireman would be, Auntie. He has yellow pants, a yellow jacket, big black boots, and a yellow hat. You know, a real-life fireman. I told my sister about what they were describing later that evening. My sister and her boyfriend and I watched a movie, and soon they went to sleep. I slept on the couch, as I had to be up at 5 a.m. to get ready for school, as I was about 15 to 20 minutes from home, and it would take that much longer to arrive. My sister had woken me up, and I laid on the couch dreading getting up and getting into the shower. Mornings were never my strong suit. She had left the light on in the living room just for me, and I sat up and tried to motivate myself further. Then I heard the toilet flush in the bathroom and thought to myself, oh, she must still be up. I wait for her to finish, when all of a sudden I saw this very tall dark figure emerge from the bathroom with the yellow pants, yellow jacket, yellow hat, and heard heavy boots as he walked across the living room and back to the girl's room. Needless to say, I was terrified. I screamed for my sister and she came out to see what I needed. I explained to her what I'd just seen. Neither of us could believe it. Not long after that, they ended up moving. The girls don't have any recollection of the fireman in that home. They have no memories of ever interacting with one. My family is gifted, so at the time my sister is well acquainted with her gift, and I was learning how to cope with mine. My eldest sister was living in a town that borders Alberta and Saskatchewan, and happened to live on the Saskatchewan side with her husband. It was a newly developed area, very nice, lots of children in the neighborhood for my two eldest nieces to play with, very family-oriented. There were always children running around, playing, laughing, and having an absolute blast. My sister and her husband were upstairs doing laundry, tending to their newborn amongst other chores. My nieces were in the basement playing in their toy room, and I was relaxing in the living area on the main floor, when I heard a knock on the front door. The front door was one of those that was half solid, half glass, the kind you could almost see through, but not exactly. As I approached the door, I saw this little girl with long, dark hair. I figured she was coming to see if my nieces wanted to join them outside on such a beautiful hot summer day. I opened the door to see a little girl standing there, at a bit of an angle, facing the way the children were playing. She was about 3.5 feet tall, with long jet black hair to her waist, straight and plain, with very blunt bangs. She was in a white dress that had ruffled top and was kind of tattered. I asked her if she was looking for someone to play with, and without saying anything, this girl jumped through the side railing of the balcony and through the next and vanished. I slammed the door, ran upstairs in tears to my sister, who was not a stranger to the paranormal either. Her husband thought I was kind of crazy, and he ran down to get the girls from the toy room and bring them upstairs. Later that evening, I was sleeping with my two eldest nieces in their room, which was adjacent to my sister and brother-in-law's room, in which they had their newborn also. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to the microwave beeping, so I went to my sister and told her what I was hearing. She woke up her husband, and he'd heard it too. He went down to investigate, and the kitchen lights kept flickering on and off between the microwave beeps, as if they were alternating. Then the smoke alarm started beeping, and then stop. He came back upstairs and we all slept in their master bedroom that night. A few months had passed and they moved back to the summer village, purchasing a beautiful lake home. Thankfully, there hasn't been any paranormal activity in the house for the last 7 years. Let's hope it stays that way. Last year, my partner and I took in a cat who had been dumped by her last owners. She was at least 14 years old and unfortunately was also dying of kidney disease, and we were told she had a few months left. We did everything we could to make her comfortable in her last months, and she actually held on for 7 months before we had to make the decision to help her cross the Rainbow Bridge. Just a side note, she loved to sleep on the table that one of our Xbox was on. We had 2 for multiplayer, and would accidentally turn it on quite regularly, and would occasionally turn on the other 2. Well, once she had passed, we chose to have her cremated. I'm quite spiritual, and we both wanted to be able to bring her home with us should we decide to move house. A few weeks after she passed, her ashes were ready to come home. The same day that her ashes came home, the Xbox on the table turned itself on. It was the only one in the room, and in the house. Ever since her ashes came home, our Xboxes will just randomly turn themselves on, and we'll have a good laugh that she's up to her old tricks. The story I'm about to share is the first time I've ever had an interaction with a ghost, and I'll never forget it. It begins like this. I was in a house share which my uncle had arranged for me after I had moved to London. The house was a terraced house in southeast London in the year of 2005. I shared the house with two of my uncle's friends, kept to myself, and just worked, came home, and enjoyed the weekends generally, as I got to grips with moving to a new country and experiencing one of the world's largest cities. It was a big change in my life, but very exciting. Back then, modern mobile phones were in their infancy. They had transitioned to color screens and very basic cameras. When I looked back at this phone, it was a Sony Ericsson, but when I compare it to phones of today, it's a night and day difference. I came back one night in the summer. In fact, it was bright when I got back from a party that night. I was so delighted with my new phone, and once in my bedroom I decided to just randomly take pictures. What happened next was pretty insane. As I scanned my photos, in the top left-hand corner of the screen was the image of a man's face. Undeniable in the background. I could even make out his mustache, big eyes and hair. I literally freaked out, big time, and ran downstairs and just freaked. I kept looking and sent the picture to friends who admitted they could see it, but offered up bizarre explanations. Over the next few weeks, I constantly took more and more pictures, and a woman's head appeared, as if she was screaming in great distress. I sent the image to a paranormal investigator, but the image did not show her face like it did on my phone. He admitted he could see something, like a blur, but it didn't want to show her the scary face like it did on my phone. I showed friends and colleagues the image, and they were all genuinely perplexed. Where it all culminated was when my pictures showed 3 little children in the photos. They were looking straight at me, and you could clearly see our smiles. They were small. My guess they were around 6 to 8 years old, but I could clearly see they were happy. I could see their smiles and felt right away that they were cheeky spirits who'd passed on to the other side, 2 boys and a girl. Not too long after my photos showed the children's spirits, I was rested and relaxed, and not far from switching off, when my mattress started gently moving from left to right, from the bottom, again and again. It was so gentle but noticeable. I literally couldn't believe what was happening, and I stayed still, and let it happen to reassure myself this is happening, and it did. Then on both soles of my feet at the exact same time, I felt what I can only describe as gentle little finger pricks on the soles of my feet. It undeniably actually happened. I wasn't scared or intimidated in the slightest. I knew who it was and that they meant no harm to me. I still think of them and how sweet they were, and I felt so bad for one so young to have to move to the other side. The room used to get ice cold over my chest of drawers at times, and the room was literally on the perimeter of an old cemetery. That was the most pleasant experience I've ever had with a phantom. I was at work on a Sunday 8 years ago. I was alone in the building after hours. I'd done the security checks and made sure there was no customers left in the store. It was a time when the place was short-staffed, so I was the only worker in that day. As it was only a very small store, one staff member could run it. I had gone upstairs to do the end-of-day process, but I had to use the restroom first. The restrooms are in a very narrow corridor, so I had built up a habit of sticking my head out of the doorway and looking left and right before exiting. This is so I don't bump into anyone that may be in the corridor. So that day I did the same thing. I looked left, then right, and saw something at the end of the corridor on my right, where the corridor turns. But it hadn't quite registered. I came out of the restroom and turned left before I realized I had seen something. I turned around and it was still there. A human-shaped shadow around 6 feet tall, and from what I could tell it looked average body width, not large or skinny. I noticed it looked as though it was wearing a top hat, or stovepipe hat. As I watched, it simply faded after around 5 seconds. Now in that corridor, there is bright lights all over the place, but there's nothing that simulates the shape of a man. But if it was lighting on something that created a shadow, then it wouldn't have faded. I did another security check just to be sure, and the place was still empty of anyone but me. A week or so later, I mentioned it to my cousin, who's older than me by a few decades. She told me that when she was younger, she was in the old family home that was rented by our mutual grandmother. She was being looked after by our mutual uncle, and told me that she was in the family bathroom one bright afternoon when the door handle began violently rattling. She thought it was our uncle, so she called to him that she was in there, but it kept on going. She called out again, and this time it stopped, only to resume a few seconds later. Annoyed, she pulled the door open to find no one was there. She stepped out into the corridor to see something descend the stairs. She assumed it was her uncle, only to look like it was wearing a top hat or a stovepipe. She followed it downstairs, and as she got to the bottom, she turned towards the dining room, followed it, but when she got into the dining room, it was standing in front of our uncle, who was asleep on the sofa. It stood there for 10 seconds or so before fading into nothing, and my grandmother told her that she had seen something similar when she was pregnant. She had told my cousin that she assumed it was her father, as he was buried wearing a top hat. I don't know what we saw, or if it was the same shadow person. Could it be our great-grandfather? And is he attached to our family somehow? My old aunt used to complain that the next-door neighbors were making all kinds of noise at 3 a.m. Number one, I doubted she could even hear them, since her hearing was really bad. And number two, those were just a nice family with 2 little kids, so I doubt they would make that much noise up late. When she died, before we sold the house, we pulled up the carpet, and there was a D, her name was Dorothy, sort of etched into the nice wood floor, and no matter how much we sanded it, it would not go away. When the realtor was in the house taking photos alone, she was in a room in the back of the house, with the bank of windows, and had closed the door of this room to get an entire view. She went to leave the room and couldn't get out. The door wasn't lockable, and she had to call out of the window to people on the sidewalk to come into the house through the unlocked front door to get her out. The door that she was stuck behind opened easily. They even tested it again, and it opened without issue. There was another thing that I can't remember now. We talked to the new owners after they'd been in the house for a year and asked us how they liked it. They said my aunt finally seemed happy with them and hadn't been haunting them as much as before. In 2008, while recovering from a major health issue, I bought my first house at the very top of the Blue Mountains just outside of Sydney. The town dates back to the 1830s and was originally a coal and timber workers' settlement and a place for travellers from Sydney to stay the night before they made the journey down to the other side of the Great Dividing Range and on through what became the prime grazing land of the Western Plains beyond. Later in the 19th century, the township became a retreat for wealthy elites who built elaborate holiday homes to escape the heat of the Sydney summer. There are a few of these homes still standing, including a beautiful manor house built by the once powerful Australian media family, the Fairfaxes, as well as a large hotel, now a pub, named after a member of British royalty who once stayed for a single night. The township is nowhere near as fancy now, returning to its working roots during the week and welcoming Sydney day trippers on weekends. While I will always love it, it has to be admitted the town has seen better, livelier days. My cottage definitely wasn't one of the mini mansions. Local law says my house was both a stable as well as a place where coachmen for the colonial-era Cobb & Co. carriages service would rest for the night before either returning to Sydney or continuing on down into the Hartley Valley via the treacherously steep Victoria Pass. When I bought the house, it was a rudimentary shack with a small kitchen, living room, bathroom, and a closed-in porch that was acting as the bedroom. I found out shortly after I moved in that the two previous owners before the man I bought it from had died suddenly within the house. One was a woman called Susan. Soon after Susan passed away at a respectable age, her much younger nephew inherited the house and within weeks passed away alone in the house from a sudden heart attack. The first night I stayed there, I was on a foam mattress on the floor in the living room, because the movers were arriving the next day, and the room had a fireplace so I could keep warm. That night as I slept by the fire, I had a feeling that there was something off about this room, like I was being watched by something not entirely friendly. But I told myself that it was my mind playing tricks on me, being in an unfamiliar environment. The next day, I furnished the bedroom and slept there from now on. Aside from that strange first night and a nagging sense that I was somehow weirdly intruding on someone else's space, I was mostly comfortable in my little home, a shelter from the storm that was my life at that stage. Soon things would change. I began walking in the middle of the night to what felt like someone pulling all my blankets and sitting on the end of my bed. I was aware of the phenomena of sleep paralysis and wrote it off as simply that, telling no one so that I didn't appear as if my mind was having issues along with my body. Because of this, I started finding more reasons to go back to Sydney, anything to get a peaceful night's sleep, which was something that didn't happen at home. Thankfully, I got some much-desired company and a sense of safety in numbers when my mother would drive up to stay with me every now and again. As there was only one bedroom, we shared a bed, with me sleeping closest to the door that led to the kitchen. Weeks after one of her visits, I travelled down to Sydney for an appointment. The next day, I stayed with my mother. That night in Sydney, when we were alone, my mother said she needed to ask me something. It's important to know that my mother is exceedingly calm, intelligent, prudent, and the definition of level-headed. But still, she looked at me with a grave look, and in a quiet voice simply asked, "Do you remember anything from the night I stayed?" I was taken aback and replied I didn't, just that I woke up tired, as if I'd had a fitful sleep. But that was nothing new. It was then that she took a deep breath and told me something I would never forget. Mum said that during the night, she had woken up with a start. She looked over the top of my sleeping body. I was soundless. Above me, near the head of the bed, standing there was the image of a severe-looking woman with grey hair scowling, staring at my mother in what she described as malice. As if that wasn't startling enough, my mother went on to say that at that very moment, I suddenly sat up straight in bed, my upper body at a right angle to my legs, blocking her view of the doorway, and then I started mumbling tirelessly in my sleep. A few moments later, I lay back down quietly, and then, all of a sudden, the vision of the woman was gone. Being about 3 times her weight and a foot taller than her, I'm very protective of my mother. All these years later, I wonder if it was me trying to protect my mother, sort of like a bodyguard against whatever stood in the doorway that night. Several years later, I had sympathetically renovated the property, created an open-plan kitchen/dining/living room area, and adding a second bedroom and turning the old living room, the room that I had stayed in the first night, into a bedroom too. Just weeks after the renovation was finished in late autumn, I was down in Sydney for another bloody medical appointment on what was an unseasonably hot and gusty day. As I sat in the waiting room, I checked the app that tracked local bushfires and saw alerts for one approaching my town. I drove like a maniac up the mountains all the time, looking by terrifyingly huge clouds of grey and black smoke in front of me by the horizon. 15 minutes after screeching to a halt in my driveway, my neighbor and I received an emergency text service from the government saying that we had to evacuate immediately. My neighbor Lena and I packed our cars. They tell you to have as part of your bushfire plan a list of all the items you want to take with you. I now realize why. My mind turns to mush with panic. Now Lena and I had two paths of escape, going down the mountains to Sydney in the east, where there were more fires and huge lines of traffic, as others in adjoining townships fled to the safety of the city, or west, going over the other side of the mountain and down the pass into Hartley Vale. We decided on the latter, taking refuge in Lena's girlfriend's house as we waited there to hear if we even would have homes to return to. Hartley Vale is just as old as the town I lived in, and has its own dark history, especially to do with the building of what they call the two bridges on the pass. Many convicts, including children, lost their lives building the road into what is essentially rocky cliffs, and until recently countless carriages and trucks have fallen over the edge of the pass, deep down into the valley below. Ghost stories from the pass abound. Our first stop before her girlfriend's house was the restaurant Lena runs, out of a beautiful historic hotel there. Lena went to grab some wine from her cellar, wisely knowing that we had a long night ahead of us and frayed nerves that needed dulling. As I waited, I wandered through the dining room and then into the back rooms. I was surprised to find these rooms. Though empty of furniture, they were in their original state from the 19th century. The history nut in me was delighted, but at the same time I remember that even though it was late afternoon on a hot day, enough to be classed as having a catastrophic bushfire, the rooms were eerily cold. I remarked on this on our third glass of wine in the evening at Lena's girlfriend's house, and Lena very plainly said, "Oh, you felt it too." She and her partner went on to tell me numerous ghost stories about cutlery moving overnight when the place is empty after closing, as well as other spooky happenings. It was so normal for them they might as well have been describing the color of the walls and what was on the menu. Realizing I was in safe company, I told Lena and her girlfriend about the goings-on at my house over the years. I described what my mother had seen, and Lena's mouth fell open as I described the woman with grey hair as Mum told it to me. "That's Susan." I was open-mouthed at first, but at the same time thought it was making sense. I then told them how hard it was to sleep through the night there, and asked Lena if she could remember anything that might help me get a quieter night's sleep. What did Susan like? What could I do to calm her presence? "Your mother has cats, doesn't she?" "Yes," I replied. Bob and Lewis were Mum's pride and joy, and had just moved into her small apartment as Mum downsized from her former house, which had a garden. Lena suggested I bring the cats up with me next time I came back up from Sydney, as Susan loved cats. I resolved to do exactly that, assuming I had a house rather than a pile of ash to return to. Well, the volunteer firefighters fought valiantly, and were able to stop the fire 3 doors down from our houses. I will be forever grateful for all the amazing work they did that day and continue to do so. I kept my word, and a few weeks later I brought Bob and Lewis home for a visit. They loved the house and having a garden again, and something shifted that weekend. The house felt warmer, lighter and brighter. Things were so peaceful that I fell asleep on the couch in front of the TV on the cat's final night with me. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a woman with grey hair leaning over me. Her face was so close to mine that I instinctively rolled away, falling off the couch onto the floor. I sprang to my feet and rushed to turn the lights on, but of course the room was empty, except for me and the two sleepy-eyed felines who looked at me with bemusement as I stood by the switch on the wall, heart pounding out of my chest. It was only a while later that I lay in bed trying to decipher it all, and I remembered a detail I had missed in my shock. The grey-haired woman wasn't scowling, she was smiling, so broadly that I could still see her teeth in my mind. I think Susan, and I'm now quite certain it was Susan, was trying to let me know that she was happy I had brought the cats to visit. The energy in the house was different the next day, and every day after. Something had changed, and though I had to sell the house years later and return to Sydney full-time, as I became healthy enough to work, I never saw her again after the night, and only ever slept soundly. Well, except for one night, but that's another story. I will always miss my little house that Susan so graciously let me take care of for her. One day I want to buy it back, and I hope Susan will welcome me home when I do. Back in Texas in the early 90s, I had a ghost that followed me from house to house. It started when we were living in a rental unit while our house was being built. My husband and I would be awoken by the sound of heavy footsteps in the attic. Of course, whenever anyone went to inspect, nothing would be amiss, and we just got used to it. I should mention that my husband's friend, who was a painter and was painting the interior of our new home, was found dead in the master closet. He had locked himself in there and spent days sniffing paint fumes, which eventually killed him. But I digress. The ghost, or whatever it was, made its presence known many times. Blow dryers would randomly turn on, doors would slam shut. But two instances come to mind. When my girls were little, I would bathe the three of them together. I never used bubble bath, just plain water. They played with one of those yellow rubber ducks while they bathed. One of the girls started to cry because she couldn't find the duck, and I couldn't see it anywhere. I took the girls out, pulled the stopper on the drain, dried the girls, and when I looked back at the tub, the damn duck was sitting in the middle of it. There was no way it was there. It wasn't there a minute ago. Then during Christmas Eve, I was wrapping the kids' presents. They were unwrapped and scattered everywhere with rolls of wrapping paper splayed all over the place. I was home alone as my husband took the girls to my parents' house. I got tired and fell asleep on the floor. I woke up a few hours later to find all the gifts were wrapped in piles for each girl and stacked up straight in a symmetrical vertical fashion. I was still home alone. Our old office space had an active ghost that would show itself to me from time to time. The communal bathroom seemed to be its favorite haunt, and I would catch reflections of a tall man in black standing behind me in the chrome fixtures and the mirror. The clincher was when it threw my phone to the ground. I was in a conference room when an office mate came and told me my phone somehow fell to the floor, despite being in the middle of my desk. No one saw it fall, but everyone heard it smash. We checked the CCTV footage, and true enough, my phone was in the middle of my desk. When it came to the part where my cell phone drops to the floor, the TV screen froze, and static obscured the screen for a moment or two. When the picture came back on, the footage showed my phone already smashed on the floor. 6 weeks later, we transferred to a newly constructed office building, and there were no ghosts there, fortunately. When I was 4 or 5, I used to see a boy standing on the counter in the kitchen from my living room. We have a breakfast bar and a large opening to see into the kitchen through that. He always had his back turned to me, and I thought it was normal. that he was on the counter because I used to climb up and get cups out. I don't remember seeing him a ton, just sometimes. I'd tell my parents and they wouldn't say anything because they didn't see anything. One day I saw him and he turned around. He had no face. I'd never seen him since, but on a few different occasions, the fire alarm would just start blaring. Could be bad batteries or dust too, but after the first time my dad changed the batteries and cleaned it, it happened again. When I was 9 years old, my great-grandmother had recently passed away, so we were cleaning out her house. I was coming out of the main bedroom, and then suddenly saw her cat coming out of the laundry room. The laundry room is just across the hallway from the main bedroom. I went to go pet the cat, and then I realized something. Wait, this cat's dead. As soon as I remembered that, she just disappeared. The creepiest thing was that she always hung around in the laundry room when she was alive. I can't believe I interacted with the ghost of a cat. I lived across the street from a cemetery, ages 5 to 12, and saw a bunch of stuff in the house. The most vivid one, though, was the previous owner, Mr. K, who had passed away in my sister's room in the late 80s. I saw him on multiple occasions just walking around the house. He would just kind of fade in and out, as he would wander, almost like if you had a strobe light on really slow. He was always smiling and never interacted with us, but it would always cause doors to sway when there was no breeze, and occasionally my Lego towers would fall to the ground. My old apartment had what we called a thirsty ghost. We used to find cups of glasses of water by the sink that were full. We would know that the cups were empty earlier, and I questioned my wife and the kids, but they all said they weren't doing it. I really thought they were playing some kind of elaborate joke on me. My wife started finding cups too, and she also thought the kids were doing it. But one day the kids and wife were out for the day, and I was home alone. I was in the kitchen and bathroom during this time, and I know that the cups were empty. I sat down to watch TV, and after about an hour went to the bathroom. Right there, next to the sink, was the bathroom cup full of water. I walked over to the kitchen, and right next to the sink on the table were 2 cups, both full of water. It was only ever 1 or 2, never more than that. We played it off because that was the only thing our ghost did. After 2 years we moved out, and I still wonder if it's doing the same thing to its current occupants.